The regional director didn't come to the Hargrove farm to sign a contract. He came to shut it down. He showed up at the gate on P.D. River Road with a legal notice in his breast pocket and the particular confidence of a man who'd never reconsidered anything he'd already decided. He looked at Ellis Hargrove the way you look at a problem you've been sent to close. 45 minutes, he told his assistant.
No, that's impossible.
Back in Colombia by lunch.
Sure.
He wasn't back by lunch. He was on the phone with his CEO, explaining that a kid had built a gold mine out of their garbage, and now the factory needed him. The Hargrove property was 38 acres of flat, sandy ground outside Lamar, South Carolina. Ellis's father Curtis had worked it the way his father had before him: row crops, some hay, thin margins, and debt Curtis wouldn't bring up at the dinner table. By 2001, the farm was in trouble. The Piedmont Wood Products facility had opened up the road in 1999. Cutting hardwood all day produced an enormous volume of fine wood shavings that had to go somewhere. In the spring of 2001, they offered Curtis $50 a month to use his fence line as a dumping ground. He said yes. $50 was $50, and the alternative was sitting in the dark. By the end of that summer, 3 shoulder-high mounds of pale shavings sat against the fence. They smelled like oak and maple and caught the afternoon light in a way that was almost beautiful if you were the kind of person who looked at things long enough. Ellis was 12. He was that kind of person. His neighbor Roy Sykes, who ran cattle to the east, started calling the piles the Hargrove Sandhills. It was a reliable laugh at the grain co-op every Saturday. Neighbors complained about the dust. Relatives shook their heads at the junkyard Curtis was apparently building. Curtis didn't answer. Ellis, standing behind his father, was already turning something over in his head, something from a soil science book he'd borrowed from the library. Wood shavings were carbon. Carbon, given the right conditions, didn't stay what it was. The first real lesson came in 2003. Ellis worked a wheelbarrow of raw shavings into 2 rows of sweet corn, expecting the soil to improve. It didn't. The raw wood fiber pulled every bit of nitrogen out of the ground. The corn came up pale, stunted, and dead. Roy Sykes drove past, slowed his truck, and laughed until he coughed. "Stick to collecting trash, boy. You weren't born to be a farmer." Ellis pulled the dead plants by hand that afternoon. Then he went back to his notebook. The problem was simple once he saw it. Carbon needed a nitrogen partner, roughly 30 parts to 1. He started mixing the shavings with kitchen scraps, grass clippings, and hog manure. He built his first composting bay in 2004. He turned the pile every 10 days with a pitchfork and pushed a thermometer into the center each morning before school. When the pile hit 59 degrees Celsius and steam rose into the cold November air, he knew the garbage was alive. Curtis Hargrove died in the winter of 2005. Ellis was 16, left with a debt-ridden farm, a mother named Delia who had never planned to run anything alone, and a fence line full of waste that the rest of the county had long since written off as an eyesore. He didn't stop turning the piles. By 2007, the corner of the farm that used to be thin sand was testing at 4% organic matter. The grass was darker. The ground held water. Nobody noticed but Ellis, who had been photographing that soil every season for 3 years. In 2008, he learned that hardwood sawdust was the ideal growing medium for gourmet mushrooms. He converted the equipment shed, inoculated the shavings with spores, and harvested his first shiitake crop. Sold out at market in 40 minutes. He told no one. He kept the sheds locked. By 2015, he was supplying specialty grocers across the state, 7 tons annually, with buyers on a 2-month waiting list. The real test came during a bad storm season. Roy Sykes had spent years digging deep drainage ditches to keep his fields clean, the practical response of an experienced man who had managed water on that land for decades. When the heavy rains hit, those ditches became high-speed channels. The water didn't drain, it organized. It accelerated through the trenches, scouring out tons of Roy's topsoil and dumping it in a gray, suffocating slurry across his pastures, carried there by the very channels he had cut to save it. On the Hargrove farm, the composted wood absorbed the impact and held the soil. While Roy watched his land wash away through the work he'd done to protect it, Ellis's fields came through untouched. In 2019, the factory sent the regional director. New regulations meant the informal dumping arrangement wasn't legal anymore. They came to issue a cleanup notice, Ellis's problem, Ellis's expense. Ellis didn't show him a junkyard. He showed him a multi-million-dollar operation. The organic certification, the municipal waste diversion contracts. The city of Darlington was paying Ellis to keep organic material out of the landfill, the mushroom barns producing 9 tons annually, the soil testing records going back to 2003. At the far end of the property, where the first truck had dumped in 2001, Ellis stopped. The mounds were gone. In their place was dark, loose earth that smelled like a forest floor. The director crouched down and pressed his hand into the soil. He pulled up a handful. He wasn't looking at waste. He was looking at the highest grade agricultural product in the state. "You want the waste back?" Ellis asked. The director looked at the soil, then at the farm, then at Ellis. He'd come to close a problem. What he found was a supplier the factory couldn't afford to lose. The contract they signed that September wasn't for $50 a month. It was a $340,000 annual partnership. The factory now pays Ellis to take the material they once used to embarrass his father. Delia Hargrove was in her 60s by then. On warm evenings she walked the fields with her son, the same fields Curtis had worked until he couldn't. She didn't say much on these walks. One evening in October she stopped at the northwest corner, the first section that had changed, and crouched down and picked up a handful of soil. She held it the way Ellis had always held it, close, unhurried. Then she set it back down and kept walking. She didn't need to say anything. Curtis had left a debt and a fence line full of waste. His son had turned one into the foundation of the other, and now neither of them would ever have to worry about this land again. Ellis Hargrove didn't set out to prove anyone wrong. He just looked at what the world called garbage long enough to understand what it actually was. That's a harder thing than it sounds. If this story made you think about something you've been walking past, leave a comment below. And subscribe for more stories about people who build something real out of what everyone else ignores.